What's up, guys? Austin Blankenship Rhapsody MTG coming at you with a non-gameplay video today. Things have been pretty hectic for me, but luckily I'm in the process of switching jobs, so I'm taking some PTO that I have saved up this week, starting out with this video, and then later on I'm going to upload some gameplay video and just kind of give an update on what my lists look like and how things are going as far as what rack is looking like in the meta. Uh, Today I want to do like a quick primer. It's something that I've wanted to do for a while, and I'm cranking out what I think is the best 75 if you had to go to a tournament this weekend, or if you were going to queue up on MTGO right now. I experiment with different things on stream all the time, so wanted to give you a look at like what I think the most consistent build of 8 rack currently is. So you'll notice all 4 Urza Saga. I know some lists run 2 and run 4 Factory. I think Urza Saga is the best card in the deck because it's one of the best cards, if not the best card in Modern right now. Pretty close to Dragon Rage Channeler and Ragavan. It's in that category. I think the more we lean into this card, the more we tend to win. Of course, the packages of cards we get is Expedition Map, Nihil Spellbomb, and Pithing Needle, and obviously the rack is our baseline plan. Urza Saga just really represents an extra way to get racks. Because of this, I think it's pretty safe to cut down to 3 Shrieking Affliction. There is a world where I've tried to go all the way down to 2 Shrieking Affliction, but I think you do that maybe when you have another threat or 2 in the main deck, but I don't think... I believe that Smallpox is a bit too important in the meta right now to main deck a lot of creatures, and Saga can kind of double as your construct threat. As far as being able to, how we sequence sagas, unlike a lot of decks that are aggressively trying, like Hammer Time, who might be aggressively trying to get the Colossus Hammer, so they play this on turn 1, we tend to want to sag our sagas as much as we can. That being said, if it's obvious you're playing against Living End or something where you need the Pithing Needle immediately, it might be a good idea to play it on turn 1 so that you have access to the Spellbomb or the Pithing Needle early. But in most situations, we want this to be our 3rd land drop. A lot of decks want it to be their 2nd land drop on curve, but we have really good 3 drops, specifically in Liliana, well, our only 3 drop really, who's still a powerhouse. And on turn 3, we often like the double spell, so we'll go Smallpox into a Fatal Push or Raven's Crime or some sort of last-minute hand disruption. You'll notice I've cut down to 2 factories. I think that Factory is one of the better upgrades for the deck that we've gotten, but I do think that 6-man lands is where you want to be at when you're running all of these double black spells. If you are in a deck where you've cut Smallpox or you're running less Liliana, I think maybe you can get away with running 4 and 4. I think one of the 5 lists that I had ran 4 and 4, but as like the more I've played with it, the more it's just nice to have that extra smoothness of your mana base. Like really, you only need 1 threat with rack to win the game. Just something that can close the door. So you don't need an overabundancy of Mishra's Factories and Urza Sagas. That being said, something to keep in mind is, 1, of course, this blocks as a 3/3 if it does not have Summoning Sickness. So you can tap it and target itself to get +1/+1 until end of turn. That happens so often is that people forget that it blocks as a 3/3. The other thing that a lot of people miss is that it is an artifact land. So it's an artifact creature when it becomes activated. So it does pump your Saga tokens. So just leaving 1 mana open can really mess up your opponent's combat math. That happens a lot on stream, is that they'll expect to be able to kill, like they'll try to go to bolt the Saga token or something along those lines, and then we just pay 1 mana to activate the factory, and all of a sudden now the Saga token is 1 toughness bigger than they expected, or it can be a combat trick, things like that. So the factory can do a lot of tricky things. It's a very powerful card. I cut it to go back up to 1 Lochtwain, and this decision was because we do run the Expedition map. The Expedition map is just a really nice plan B when the rack plan isn't working. So if we're playing against a blue-white control deck that is just going to sit there and like let us cast their discard spells, then Archmage's Charm, draw two, and they're just going to constantly, where they've resolved the Jays or something like that, they're constantly going to keep pace with our discard spells, or whatever, we'll be able to get ahead on them. That gives us the ability to either draw some cards with Castle Lochtwain or just string a couple sagas together and make a couple big threats. Ideally, this should be one of these should be a silent clearing. That's a bit nitpicky, but as many Pithing Needles are around, I think it's like if you're going 100% the most optimal list, you probably want to split your draw lands, like play around things like Pithing Needle as much as you can. Another thing with the mana base, there are 4 Urborgs. If you wanted to cut factory completely or cut down your number of sagas, you could probably go down to 3 Urborgs. But I think that the amount that we sacrifice or discard our own lands to Smallpox and Raven's Crime, that it's really not much of a downside to run all 4 of them. And I do like the number of 24 lands, especially with Saga. You really, really, really want to make a land drop every turn if you can help it. And Raven's Crime really helps. Like, there's been so many games where I've won where my opening hand was 1 Raven's Crime and 6 lands, and we got there just because we were able to deplete their resources so fast. Outside of all that, let's move to the 1-drops here. Fatal Push is always a good removal spell. It's better now in the format than it's ever been. I would say maybe when Prowess was the deck, it was slightly better, but it's really important against Hammer Time to have the instant speed removal. It's very important against Ragavan, against Dragon Rage Channeler, cards like that where you don't want them to untap with the card, and you really need to kill it and get rid of it on turn 1, or just really immediately when they play it. You don't want them to get any value off those cards, because even just Dragon Rage Channeler into Bolton U or something is, they get a lot of value of that. They get the Pseudo Scry, they get to fill up their graveyard more. The one of Funeral Charm, I flip back and forth with this card a lot. There's usually two flex spots in the main deck, and right now I'm using them as a split between Funeral Charm and Dismember. So Funeral Charm, I think it's unplayable unless that second mode is relevant. So that second mode, the target creature gets +2/-1 until end of turn. If the format is where, like, say maybe 30% of the meta that kills their 1-drops, then I think this is a good card. If you can kill Ragavans, you can kill Dragon Rage Channelers when the graveyard's, if you have a Nihil Spellbomb to get rid of their graveyard, or if it's not active yet, you have that option. Surprisingly, I used to joke around a lot when Mutavault was our land, that I think that my one thing that I've done more than anyone is either give Mutavault Swamp Walk or +2/-1 to swing for lethal damage with Funeral Charms, which is not a lot. I think it's like 4 or 5 times, so that's probably more than most people alive, or probably more than everyone. So if you beat that, tell me if you've done that more than 4 or 5 times. But actually, with the construct tokens, those things aren't like that's just gravy. It's not completely relevant. But if you have Urborg out and you give a 6/6 construct Swamp Walk, like, that could win you games. So it is relevant. I've seen some lists go all the way up to 2 to 4. I think it's always just okay. It's kind of in that Raven's Crime spot where it's just 1 mana, they discard a card. Of course, Raven's Crime's better because of the retrace. But being able to instant speed, get something out of their hand at their draw step. There are some like fun things and tricky things with it. I think it's the only 1 mana instant speed discard spell in the format. I think Kolaghan's Command might be the only other one period that forces your opponent to discard of instant speed. At least it's the only other playable one, if you consider Funeral Charm playable. But that's where that's at. I think 1 is fine. If you want to run 2, that's the max. I've got 1 more in the sideboard. I'll go over that here in a minute. Of course, Inquisition and Thoughtseize, just your bread and butter. Obviously, you tend to want to lead on Inquisition over Thoughtseize. The only exception to this is if you are playing against Living End. The new card that deals with your Leyline of the Voids is a 4-drop. So but they can evoke it for 2 mana. So on your turn 2, like before their turn 2, your turn 1, their turn 2, depending on if you're on the play or the draw, lead on Thoughtseize instead of Inquisition, because Inquisition will not hit that. and you will lose your Leyline, and you will be very sad. Happened to me once, right when that card got printed, and I said, okay, never again. I'm going to remind myself that every time I play it. Lead on the Thoughtseize in that specific situation. Most of the time, Inquisition is what you want to do turn one. If you played any sort of mid-range deck, you generally know that, but it's good to be reminded of it. Raven's Crime, of course, it's just probably like kind of the hidden, I wouldn't say best card of the deck, but it's the glue of the deck. It allows you to turn dead draws late game into a way of preventing your opponents from just hoarding cards in hand to dodge your rack effects. So it does a lot of good things, and 1 mana to discard a card is on rate, so we're fine with that. 1 mana, 1 for 1, we'll take it all day. Just not much else to say about Raven's Crime. It's a solid overall card. We've gone over the fact that we've only running 3 Shrieking Afflictions. Kind of gone over the package here. The only thing to know is that Nihil Spellbomb is a lot more relevant than it looks. I probably, like, almost every time I play against the Izzet mid-range deck, this is the card that I tutor up off the first Saga. To be able to keep them from getting the mana for a Murktide, or from having a really powerful Dragon Rage Channeler. It's actually a pretty big deal. Like, it can swing games significantly, and it cantrips, so you're not down a card. So I like it a lot. It's one of my favorite cards that I've ran in the deck. I think it's a staple for it. I've thought about going up a couple on the sideboard, but right now we have enough graveyard hate, and we'll go over the sideboard in a minute. Smallpox, there was a point in time where I experimented with 3. It's just too good. I thought about making an entire video just going over why Smallpox is so much better in 8 rack than it looks on the surface too. Because when you pox somebody, you're getting rid of a creature, more than likely, a land, more than likely, and a card in their hand. Really, that does represent 3 cards for 2 mana, and it doesn't seem like it. It just seems like 1 card and you might kill a creature. But the likelihood now that they can hoard their lands in their hand instead of making their land drops is a lot lower. So it actually really, like, it forces them to make their land drops. So you're reducing the resources they have significantly, and obviously we break parity with that pretty well by having a lot of cards that are redundant or that we don't really care about, or like Raven's Crime, you can pitch for value. If you want to go really deep, you can run things like Bloodghast as your threats in the sideboard, but I don't think that really fits in the meta right now. Dismember, I think, is a little bit better than Funeral Charm in most cases. Hammer Time is really important right now to be able to deal with, so I don't think that it's... I'd rather have the 1 extra removal spell that can kill something at instant speed than relying on multiple Funeral Charms, so that's why I'm up with 1 of the Dismember's main, and I've got 1 back in the sideboard. Of course, Liliana, just staple of the deck. I can't ever imagine not running 4 of her. You know, her power level's gone down a bit over the years, but for our game plan specifically, you couldn't ask for a better card. Sideboard, Feed the Swarm, it's the only real way that we have to deal with Leyline of Sanctity, and I think it's fine. Like, we have other mutual discard effects, like landing and sticking a Liliana is important, but it's also, like, it's not horrible to bring in against Amulet Titan. It's just 2 mana, kill a creature if it has to be. Like, if they have 1 big creature that you have to deal with, I go ahead and bring those in those matchups as well, where a Fatal Push maybe doesn't hit some of their threats. Like I said, 1 Funeral Charm, 1 more Dismember. I think that's what I would run on the sideboard right now, and it's pretty 50-50 when I would bring these in versus not. So, like, against the Izzet decks, I'd probably go down another Shrieking Affliction or 2 and bring in the Dismember for sure, and probably the Funeral Charm. Because we really, like, that game, we don't really win that game by racing them. We win it by answering their threat and keeping threats off the board and slowly grinding them away. It's a little bit different than Prowess. But it's similar in the sense that, like, you have to kill their creature, and if you kill their creature, they just do a lot of wheel spinning, and it's pretty easy to handle them as long as they're not clocking you pretty well. Dauthi Voidwalker, there's a couple different... Usually I like to run 3 to 5 threats. These were Waste Knots for a while because of Waste Knots are a really good card against the Hell's Kitchen type decks. I'm almost never seeing those decks anymore. They've kind of fell out of favor, it seems like, so these 2 cards were Waste Knots for about a month, but now I think that Pithing Needle and some other card and like some graveyard hate things are enough that like we have the resources. We don't have to have specific hate cards. The Waste Not is nice because it doubles as a little bit of a threat and value engine against control decks, but they're not as popular in the meta right now either. Voidwalker, this was Rotting Regisaur for a long time, but Unholy Heat has made Rotting Regisaur so much worse. The one mana being able to deal 6 if you have Delirium, so like that, and they never take it out against us, uh, like they used to when you saw 8 rack. You would take out all your removal spells, but Saga has like kept things like Fatal Push and Unholy Heat relevant in the matchup, so they'll tend to not board those out as aggressively as they used to. But Voidwalker has passive graveyard hate, and that's very important against the Delver type decks, and it could also just be a threat. Any of these like passive effects where it's not as aggressive, like Nihil Spellbomb and Dauthi Voidwalker, where you can keep them from getting the value from their graveyard, is very good in the matchups. I would say that since I've made a couple of those adjustments, that the matchup went from looking like fairly, I wouldn't say unwinnable, but bad, to like it's pretty favorable now. I think I've like 7 or 8-0 streak against them so far, but also the deck's a little bit warped to handle that deck specifically. Outside of that, just a couple of board wipes. This is for any decks that really, really swarm. That's kind of where, we can't handle them maybe making 20 power up by turn 4 with a bunch of 1-drops, so we need a way out. So this is the staple. It's still the best board wipe for our deck, even though your lands don't untap, because they're very often where 3 mana is what you need to not die. So 1 extra Pithing Needle. Always, before Saga was printed, I was running 3 to 4 of these on the sideboard straight up. I thought about moving them to the main deck. But now I think having access to 2 of the needles is still really important against many of the matchups, like Planeswalker decks. We have a really hard time against Planeswalkers. And just any number, like Hell's Kitchen, it's not as popular, but turning off Stoneforge Mystic and then being able to also turn off the equip of like Yawgmoth Nexus or Colossal Hammer. They're very relevant. They do a lot of good things. And it's almost, we can kind of get away with like the blind Pithing Needle is very often a thing that comes up in Magic where it's maybe not as good as a Sorcerous Spyglass for a lot of decks, but we have so many ways to look at our opponent's hand that we pretty much know like all the time what we want to name with Pithing Needle in any given situation. So I still think it's very, very good in our deck. Void Mirror, it can be Tron hate. It's a little bit of a non-vote with our Urborg because they can tap one of their lands for black, but it is mostly in the deck for the Cascade type decks and also shuts off Living End. So it's in here for Crashing Footfalls and Living End decks mostly. I would still bring them in against Tron because they've kind of replaced the Damping Sphere slot, but Tron's just not as popular as it used to be. So that's kind of taken that slot up. Of course, 3 Leyline of the Voids. As far as anything else goes, some questions with sequencing. Just with Saga, like I mentioned, Saga is typically the 3rd or 4th land unless you need a silver bullet immediately. Then you might want to play it out early, or if it's you just have 2 lands and you need to play it out. That's how things kind of go with sequencing. Anything else like that, it's pretty general. If you've ever played 8-rack before, it's the same. I still take the draw. A lot of people have moved to taking the play, but I think that even against burn and decks like that, just having the 1 extra card over your opponent is usually more relevant than the play versus the draw because we deplete their resources so fast. So you don't have to necessarily worry about a deck killing you on turn 3 like maybe you would if you were a control deck as often. So if you played against decks like Elves or something like that, maybe that's a little bit different, but that's not exactly the most popular deck in the format. As far as sequencing, continued Smallpox on turn 2, it's just kind of a call. Like most things, you just have to like understand the situation with sequencing, like knowing when to hold peatlands that you need to be able to revolt a Fatal Push and like not crack them too early, or like hold your Fatal Push for when your Saga gets cracked so that you have revolt. And there's a lot of little things that you just kind of pick up from playing Magic in general a lot, but outside of that, it's a pretty straightforward deck still. Saga gives a little bit of flexibility. Like there are when to get Expedition Map versus when to get a rack is probably the one that would guess most people have the hardest time with. I would say anytime that your opponent has four or more cards in hand, just go ahead and get the map. Unless you know that you're getting ready to completely reduce their hand to nothing and they're at a low life total, the amount of times where you can just get make two Saga tokens, get a map, and then you're ready to do it all over again the next turn and make your Saga tokens even bigger. It just gives you such a really solid plan B to the deck. And sometimes even like you'll use the expedition map to just get a factory or just get our one of Lochtwain. Sometimes you need a little bit of card advantage, things like that. But overall, it's really there to string sagas together and make it so we have a plan B that's good against a lot of decks that we struggle with, like putting pressure on planeswalkers or any sort of time where our opponent's doing something that like we can't really handle, or maybe Enchantress where they have Leyline of Sanctity main deck or something, and a lot of our spells are dead, so we're having to make Saga tokens to race. So anything like that, that's what it's there for. I thought about in the past maybe adding one or two more utility lands, but I don't think they're necessary. And I think that unless you're going up to multiple expedition maps, that's not really the plan you want to be on. So I think that's going to do it for today, guys. If you have any other questions, but I think this is the best 75. A lot of decks have put up results with different 75s, but there's such a high floor with 8 rack that like you're going to be able to get 5 O's with the shell of the deck pretty. I wouldn't say often. It's a kind of hard deck to get 5 O's with, but it's a hard deck to do worse than 3-2 with, just because the amount of times your opponent's mulligan, you kind of get free wins off of them. But it's pretty. If you know what you're doing, and you're a good Magic player in general, you're not going to have too hard of a time piloting the deck. There is a bit of a learning curve specifically with Saga, but if you've played some Modern and have a good idea of what you need to be doing with that card anyway, just the only real difference is that it's not the turn one land almost ever. I don't think. I think maybe against Living End I'll play it on turn one, but that's like if I know for sure that they street wraithed it into something. But overall, it's pretty simple, pretty straightforward. This is the 75 that I would take to a tournament if I was going tomorrow. And thank you guys for watching. We'll get some gameplay later this week.